Mm. Okay, it looks like we are recording right now. Welcome everyone today to our guest lecture with Dr. Colin Gray. And I want to do a formal introduction for everyone before we get started with Colin's presentation. So just to give you a little bit of background information about Colin, and I got this from the website. Hey. So Colin Gray is an assistant professor at Purdue University in the Department of Computer Graphics Technology. He's the program lead for an undergraduate major and graduate concentration in UX design. And Colin, has a PhD in Instructional Systems Technology from Indiana University, Bloomington, and MD in Educational Technology from the University of South Carolina, and an MA in Graphics Design from Savannah College of Arts and Design. And he has worked as an art director, contract designer, and trainer, and has continued on design activity on how it is learned. I also want to add that Dr. Gray leads the UX Pedagogy and Practice Lab, which focuses on research at the intersection of design education, practice, ethics, and critical theory. So with that, I want to pass it on to Colin and his presentation on dark patterns and ethical engagement in design activity. I'm very much looking forward to this talk. So Colin, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anilda, for the invitation. This is really a pleasure to talk about dark patterns with people that are from my graduate experience, because I don't get to talk to a lot of people from the education audience these days. So thank you so much for joining us. I do have the chat open, and I'd encourage you to tell me if you'd like me to clarify something, to go back over a concept again, to go back a slide. And then there will be a few points at which I'm going to ask for some participation. And I would encourage you to participate in the chat. I will be watching. We might end up doing a little bit of a choose your own adventure, because there are lots of slides, lots of different studies that we've done regarding dark patterns, and all of them are equally exciting to me, so I'd rather find the things that are exciting to you. So with all of that said, I'll just echo what Anilda has already said. I've been in a lot of different environments, education being my primary interest, late in my master's work and all the way through my, my doctoral education. And I found my way into a very interesting and weird spot, leading one of the nation's first undergraduate user experience design majors, which is an emerging space. A lot of you from an instructional design lens might know this more from the learner experience sort of angle. And I've also been really fortunate to have opportunities to work with some collaborators around the world at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom and Beijing Normal in China. So the work of the lab really focuses on three main areas, and these are reflective of the areas where I would have formal training. So of course, education, that's why we're here tonight, and thinking about instructional design as a form of design activity and as a design discipline in its own right. Thinking about design as a transdisciplinary form of study, and considering how do people design across many, many fields, not just instructional design? What are the decisions that people go and make in regard to design? How do they learn to become those designers? And my primary appointment here now is closer to the human-computer interaction space. And that's where I spend a lot of my time doing publishing. And you'll see that in some of the work that I'm going to share tonight. So I'm going to locate myself for the purpose of this presentation primarily between the HCI and design spaces, but I'm going to try to articulate the purpose of the studies that we've done and some of the things that we found primarily for an education audience, because I know that that's going to hopefully make things a little bit more valuable for all of you listening. And the lab addresses these issues from a critical theory and from a social responsibility lens. And so we certainly don't see design activity as being amoral. We think about the values that we bring as designers, the ways that those values are inscribed into the learner experiences or the artifacts that we produce, and also think about the long-term consequences of those decisions as well. And so the lab I direct does work across all these spaces, although funding often dictates what you get to do. And so funding has dictated that dark patterns has become the real focus. And so that design, cognition, criticality, and ethics bucket has gotten more publications in the past couple of years than maybe some of the rest of these have. But all 4 of these are interests of mine, and I have students working in most of them right now. So this diagram kicked off my interest in dark patterns almost a decade ago. I think this was probably, well, not almost a decade, about 7 years ago. I was at IU at the time, and I was doing a minor area of focus in human-computer interaction design. And I was interacting with some people in the studio there, and one of them was doing his master's capstone on this thing called dark patterns. I'd never heard of the term before, even though it had been around in the literature for a few years. And he had this diagram that he was working with in his capstone, which I've sort of roughly approximated with a prettied up version here. And when he talked about dark patterns, he was using an idea that came from Harry Brignall, who I'll introduce in a second. But the idea was relatively simple. Dark patterns are places where stakeholder value is increased and user value is decreased. And it's not that we have to always strive for an exact equality there, but it's where things get out of balance that things become concerning very quickly. And so you can see with this semantic differential is 4 different kinds of patterns that might come into play in the things that we design. Anti-patterns are simply just bad design. Things that were done without enough skill, and so the end user experience is just horrible. Dark patterns are examples where things are actually carefully designed to trick people. And then you can see persuasive patterns as a place where user value and stakeholder value are somewhat in balance, and honest patterns are patterns that favor user value over stakeholder value. And you can see this in the definition that Harry Brignall gave to dark patterns when he introduced the concept a little over a decade ago. A couple words about Harry. He's a practitioner in the United Kingdom. He did his PhD in cognitive science, but his career has been primarily focused in the UX practice domain since this work sort of came across. So he sounded the warning bells really around the start of the smartphone era, which I don't think is coincidental. And he started talking about this idea of dark patterns as essentially the study of human psychology and user psychology run amok or gone bad. So he talks about dark patterns as a user interface that's carefully crafted to trick people into doing things. They're not mistakes. They are carefully crafted with a solid understanding of human psychology, and they have an user's interest in mind. Now this sort of reflects something that we commonly do from a user experience design perspective, and we call it user research, figuring out who our users are going to be, what makes them tick, what they care about, how they operate, what kinds of technology devices they're using, and then we try to design better experiences based on that information. And you do that as instructional designers as well. You do it through task analysis, through learner analysis, and lots of other kinds of analyses that give you a sense of who you're going to be building learner experiences for. In this case, you're taking all that information that you've carefully collected, and then you're figuring out how can we use this against the user in a way that maybe they won't even recognize that they're being hurt. And so this was the start of the idea of dark patterns, and at the time it really reflected changing norms in e-commerce and changing norms in what was then Web 2.0, so where you were starting to be able to write stuff back onto the web and how you would engage in those experiences. Facebook was also very early on at this point, and smartphones were just starting to be used en masse. Came up with a list of a number of different dark pattern types that he saw playing out in lots of different arenas. And most of these, you'll notice, have something to do with e-commerce. So sneak into basket, the idea of bait and switch, disguised ads, price comparison prevention, all of those were generally sort of playing out within an e-commerce space. And some of the rest of them also talked about sort of longer task flows where, for instance, privacy zuckering, where you're tricked into publicly sharing more information about yourself than you intend to, or misdirection, where it distracts you from doing what you really intended to focus on. So this is a really wide range of patterns that were playing out. And he developed a website, darkpatterns.org, which is still around. There's also now a subreddit and a Twitter channel or Twitter handle that tracks dark patterns. And the original intent of these was to name and shame bad offenders, to identify companies that were doing these things and then to call them out on it in hopes that they would change their practices. Hasn't really worked out so much that way, unfortunately, though. The capitalist machine is still alive and well. And in fact, a study done by some people at Princeton just this past year of e-commerce sites. They looked at hundreds of e-commerce websites. They found that about 2/3 of all e-commerce websites include one or more types of dark patterns in the user experience. And so this is by far an extinct practice. This is actually a practice that is alive and well, and we see it all over the place, not just in an e-commerce setting. So when we look at dark patterns, you might be wondering, like, what does a dark pattern look like? You might have some images in your mind already of what these might look like, but I'm going to provide a more concrete example. And so this one came about around the period of the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. And what you see here is something that was originally intended to be deployed on Instagram, and there's a hair that's superimposed on top. And you and I can probably see, looking at our screens, yeah, that's fake. But on a smartphone device, it's small enough that it looked like a real hair. And guess what? People tried to swipe it away. And when they swiped it away, they interacted, engaged with the ad. Their engagement numbers went up, and the Chinese shoe company was pretty happy about that. So much so that you actually saw copycats starting to emerge within about a week of this original dark pattern appearing a couple of years ago. Also, lots of other examples of things that you probably experienced. Have you ever gone on to book a hotel room and it starts a countdown that says, this price will only be good for the next 30 minutes? Or 7 other people are looking at this hotel room at the same time as you are. Well, the Princeton study actually showed that most of these numbers are fake. They're generated through random number generators using JavaScript that's live on the client side. And even so carefully as to provide an array of different usernames and to superimpose those to say, Kathy bought this hotel room yesterday, don't you want to buy it today? Same thing with the countdown timer. Most of them, when it gets down to 0, it just starts counting again from the top. So these actually aren't even that sneaky. They do draw on human psychology, but they're not sophisticated at all. And they're actually pretty easy to ferret out if you know what to look for. But we felt like there was some work to be done expanding on Rignall's work. And so in 2015, I wrote a grant to look at this further. And in 2017, the NSF decided to fund it, which I was pretty excited about. Because as an early faculty member, any sorts of funding looks better when you go for promotion and tenure. And so there are a few things that we specifically wanted to do and articulate that Rignall's goals weren't really set towards. First was, what are user and stakeholder interests? And what are the ones that actually should be kept in mind or are being kept in mind? What is the user actually being tricked into doing? With what motivation? And is it actually all that harmful? Or is it really harmful? Are there instances where being tricked into doing something is actually something that you want as a user? Really classic persuasive design stuff, like how do you lose weight or get more active or eat better? Those are places where you almost want to be tricked into doing the right thing, even if you feel a little bit out of control of the situation. And this is the big one for us, looking at, are there patterns that are actually just fine right now, but with the change in tech infrastructure, the availability of data, the contexts of use, that it could actually become really dark and really concerning later on. And we're probably seeing a lot of those examples in our everyday lives. So we got money to do things. And the grant actually just ended in August after about 2.5-year run. And we've been able to publish quite a few pieces of research based on this information, primarily oriented towards the human-computer interaction audience, because that's the primary audience that was funding us. Now, there are lots of different pieces that we wanted to uncover. And I like to do everything, and that's really a problem when you're trying to look at things professionally. But as a researcher, I wanted to figure out, like, what are all the different lenses that we can look at this idea of dark patterns from? And then what are the angles that we can attack, given the fact that we have 2 years to work on this? And so what you see up here is actually the work of my PhD student, Shruti, in trying to articulate all of the different interconnected studies that we had planned and all the publications that resulted from them. So I'm not going to refer to this directly, but just to say there's lots of different angles on this, and I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them today. But if any of you want to follow up on any of these angles and talk a little bit offline in the future, I'm more than happy to share a little bit more information. What I will be doing is trying to provide some overall frame up of what we've uncovered in relation to dark patterns. And I want to conclude today by talking about, instead of just user experience interactions in general, what this might mean for the design of instruction, for educational environments, and for the kind of design work that some of you might be doing already or might be doing in the future. And I'd be happy to entertain questions around that topic as well. There are some places where you can go and look at some pieces that have already been published. So if one of the things that I talk about tonight is especially interesting, you can track down these publications quite easily. They're all listed on my lab website, and specifically the Dark Patterns lab website, which is darkpatterns.uxb2.com. And so there are a run of papers that have been presented at CHI, which for those of you that aren't as familiar with HCI, is the premier international destination for publications. And so the three on the left were all published as full papers. And for an education audience, that's roughly equivalent to a journal publication, because computer science and HCI do their own thing. This is considered as rigorous and as substantial. It doesn't later become a journal publication in most cases. So I'm going to cover some of the ground that's represented by these, but I'm not going to go like paper by paper. I'm going to go more theme by theme. Are there any questions before we go one level deeper into things about what I've sort of shared so far in relation to dark patterns? Feel free to type something in the chat. Excellent. While you're thinking about questions, I'll show you a couple of other things. So the piece you see up here actually came at the same time as me writing my first dark patterns grant. So in this case, I was collaborating with my former PhD advisor, Elizabeth Bowling, looking at what the ethical and value-related issues and trade-offs are when you design experiences for learning. And we framed this up as a problematic for a special issue of ETR&D. And this is probably the best resource to look back to if you're interested in investigating ethics in relation to instructional design a little bit more, because we tried to focus this publication for an instructional design audience, while also synthesizing literature from science and technology studies, from design, from HCI, and from professional ethics and other contexts. And there's actually a nice frame up in the middle specifically doing a content analysis of articles from International Journal of Designs for Learning to talk about how these ethical issues start to be surfaced and some of the issues they might represent. Ooh, Ahmed, starting out with, isn't dark pattern just smart marketing? And in fact, my first 2 degrees were in graphic design. And you know, there's a reason why I didn't go into work as a graphic designer, because it just made me feel very dirty all the time when I was doing graphic design work. In some sense, these patterns that are now represented as dark patterns in UIs are definitely the same patterns that marketers have been using for decades to try to convince you that you need something when you really don't need something. So yes, I think there's a strong parallel between marketing and this presence of dark patterns. The challenge is thinking about issues of user agency, especially in environments where users can very easily be lied to, be marginalized, be stripped of autonomy or agency. And we're seeing, if any of you are familiar with the book Algorithms of Oppression, this is an issue not just in e-commerce sites, but this is an issue in like how public aid is given out, how public housing is accessed, how people file their taxes. There are lots of areas of our life where dark patterns often come into play, not even intentionally, but they really impact the equity of and inclusivity of those services. So I would actually say, yes, some of it's smart marketing, but that smart marketing is probably wrong too, from an ethics perspective. And we actually have some good examples from the EU in particular, where they're starting to crack down on the way that you ask users to consent to the data being collected, the kinds of privacy rights that people have, the kind of data security rights and data protection rights that users have. And so I think we'll expect to see a lot more push towards that, especially from the EU side. I'd love to see more interest from the United States side, but unfortunately our legislative system is broken. So who knows how that will work out. So this is a big issue, especially for children. Now, I don't do any research with children myself, but there are lots of people that do work in this area. And this is a space where we've designed much quicker than we can understand the impacts of what we've designed. And so think of it almost like asbestos in the 1950s and 60s, where everyone was like, this is a great insulator, we should use it everywhere. And then they didn't realize for a couple decades that it actually was really problematic. And even now we're, having to do remediation on buildings that were built during that time period because somebody didn't actually think through things enough. Same thing is happening now with tech addiction. And the biggest targets of tech addiction in terms of government and research not my work, but more broadly, is focused on this idea of persuasion and how much persuasion is appropriate to use with children. And so you can see examples like screen time from Apple that helps give you a sense of what's happening behind the scenes and helping you make more educated decisions. But as much as those kinds of data protection sort of mechanisms are starting to come online, there's also major issues about how we think we can engage with children in relation to the interactions that we set for them. And so this was an article that came out in August, but I think it still rings really true. So it's this quote from Baroness Kidron: "The idea that it's okay to nudge kids into endless behaviors just because you're pushing their evolutionary buttons, it's not a fair fight." And I would certainly agree that it's not a fair fight for children. I would argue it's not a fair fight for adults either. And in fact, I was just talking about this. I came from teaching a 3-hour studio right before this. And one of the things that we were talking about today were different levels of emotional response using Norman's emotional design text. And so there's a lot that's happening with us at a visceral level where we're automatically conditioned to respond in a certain way just because of the way our bodies are wired. And so our bodies are wired to want like these dopamine rushes and this adrenaline because it makes us feel good. And so, you know, if you're going to get a little dopamine rush every time a new YouTube video starts to play, then that's going to make you happy. It's going to make you want to keep on watching that thing. And you're not going to think, should I be doing that thing or not? It's just going to keep playing and it's going to keep making you happy. And so not only is it an issue for kids, I would argue it's really an issue for adults as well, because we aren't really able to control our primitive brains either. And so this is a real challenge as we move forward. So there is what I call a continuum of evil, however. So we can think about, you know, preying on kids and trying to get them to, you know, spend their parents' credit cards, probably pretty evil. But, you know, is it evil to like gamify an app to help them learn multiplication better? You know, is that problematic, even though it's drawing on a lot of the same psychological and persuasive impulses? That's an issue that I think requires a lot more nuance to sort of figure out. So when we look at a continuum here, I'll set up a continuum just for purpose of illustration. We can imagine stuff that we all agree is super evil. And then we can imagine stuff that is super value-centered. And what values is an issue, or which values or whose values is certainly an issue when we talk about values. But let's just accept the continuum for the moment. You have stuff right in the middle, which I would just argue is like generic capitalist design. Like it's designed to turn a profit, but hopefully it's designed to sort of respect users too, because happy users means they're going to spend more money. And so generic capitalist. If you go up a rung from that towards value-centered, then you might have stuff like user-centered design, human-centered design, or, you know, in your context, it would be instructional design that's motivated by learner needs and sort of the realities of instruction and equity and inclusion and those kinds of things. If you go up one more level, then you might imagine that participatory design or co-design practices or civic design might be something where you're not just designing something for an audience, you're actually engaging that audience and designing the thing with them, alongside them. And so hopefully their values are even more intertwined in the work that results. So that's the fun value-centered side. It's been talked about a lot, and there's a lot to discover there. I've been looking at the negative half of the continuum. So starting with dark patterns, which I've already defined as that area where shareholder and stakeholder shareholder values and user values are sort of out of whack, and that like sneaky use of psychological principles against users to maybe make something that's not in their best interest. There's also one more level, which we've been doing more study of in the lab. It is a real phenomenon. It's an academic word now called asshole design. And it is based on a subreddit of the same name. It has over 1 million members. Might be fun for some of you to check out. There are some examples of bad design in there, but there are lots of examples of design that's not just sneaky, but design that is like outright coercive and sort of evil. And not just what you'd expect from a typical capitalist perspective. And we do have a publication under review at CHI right now, looking at this phenomenon in a little bit more depth. We have a late-breaking work that got published last April on this subject if you want to read a little bit more. What I'm going to talk about from now on is not really going to focus on the happy, beautiful side of design where we meet users' needs, because we can all agree that that needs a little bit more improvement, but there's already a lot of literature to focus on that. I'm going to be focusing more on how do designers engage in evil, even when maybe they aren't trying to be evil. Because it is about intentionality, but it's also about the impact that these designs have. So if we look at this continuum real quick, we can see, how do you make some of these evil? Well, you can make civic design evil by not including the right people, not giving somebody a seat at the table. Results in inequity, and it results in solutions that are only designed for certain kinds of individuals. If you're doing user-centered design, you can make it evil just by only going for what people often call empathy light. This is a term from John Kolka, who's a design educator and theorist, where you get just enough information to feel like you know the people that you're designing for, in this case, learners, but you don't really know them in their story enough to make educated decisions. For generic capitalist design, you only see the user as a potential customer. And in fact, there's a whole branch of UX that's called CX, customer experience. They only care about you if you're going to pay for something. Otherwise, we don't really care about you so much. In dark patterns, we're evil because we try to reduce users' agency and their value. And with ASL design, we're actually outwardly and explicitly trying to coerce users into doing the thing that matters for us, not worrying as much about what matters for them. Okay, any questions on the continuum of evil, or where some instructional design practices might fit within that? Because there's definitely some evil instructional design work happening as well.
Especially on Facebook.
Oh yes, oh yes. But I mean, even like MOOCs and things like that, there are lots of opportunities to sort of screw with users. Data-centered instructional design practices, the same thing. So you see lots of opportunities to play across the spectrum, to feel like you're doing good work, but in fact be reproducing sort of inequity, or to actually outwardly be valuing maybe a learner only as a learner and not as a human being, for instance.
Colin, I have a question. Who regulates this? Like, is there an agency that regulates any of this?
So sadly, the answer is only sort of. In the EU, they have much stronger legislation. So GDPR is the law of the land now in the EU, and that deals with data protection and the way that data access has to be consented. But it doesn't protect against a lot of these things. It only protects against a very narrow band of these things. So price comparison prevention, if you remember that dark pattern from earlier, that was banned in the EU because airlines were making it really difficult to pick the right price for the right fare. And that was actually banned as a discriminatory practice in the EU. It's still perfectly legal in the United States, but they don't do it anymore because they want it to work internationally. In the United States, the story is pretty sad, unfortunately. So the Federal Trade Commission does have jurisdiction over some of these issues, but they've been, I think, very unwilling to appear activist. And a lot of these practices, as you can see, can very easily be framed as anti-capitalist. And nobody wants to do that in the United States. And so there's a lot of autonomy around these kinds of things. And while I think there's a possibility of legislation or lawsuits in the future, there's not been as much movement in the United States. Probably the biggest push that we've seen was, I think it was in February of this year, Mark Warner introduced a bill into the Senate called the Detour Act, which was focused on legislating out of existence dark patterns, although they define dark patterns in sort of an odd way. And it was only for tech companies that had 100 million or more active users per month. So basically Facebook, Google, Twitter, the normal subjects. So beyond that, there really is no legislation beyond getting bad reviews from the Better Business Bureau. Or if you really are deceitful, then it might take a decade to wind through the courts and you might end up getting censured by the FTC or something like that. But unfortunately, there's very little hope from the public policy side at the moment, but I hope that could change. The biggest driver of this is that most users don't realize they're being manipulated. And this is one of the most concerning things perhaps about the situation. So in learner environments, you sort of hope that you trust the learning institution. In your case, you're in class, so hopefully you're trusting the fact that your professor knows your stuff, that you're going to get a real degree when it's all said and done. And so trust is sort of what makes the system work. We also trust the apps and experiences that we use, but most users tend to blame themselves if anything goes wrong. So this is like user experience design or user-centered design 101, where if you put an interface in front of somebody and they do the wrong thing and they get a result different than what they want, the first thing they will do almost 100% of the time is blame themselves. They'll say, oh, I'm not a very good computer user. I'm not good with technology. Or oh, I read that as that, but oh yeah, that probably makes more sense that it did this other thing. So they sort of explain away the issues rather than actually realizing they're being actively manipulated. And that's a real concern. Okay, are you ready for the choose your own adventure part? Okay, we have 4 different directions that we could go. So the first is looking at so we generated a corpus of stuff, of examples of dark patterns. It's all live on the web, darkpatterns.uxv2.com. I'm happy to talk through how we generated that corpus and some of the patterns that we found as strategies. That might be useful. We've also looked at this on social media. So we've looked at how practitioners use the dark patterns hashtag on Twitter to name and shame companies and to identify bad actors and bad products. I also have some early work on asshole design here to look at what kinds of things people surfaced as being asshole-like and the ways in which they were sharing that information. I also have a little bit of information on Reddit focusing on what we call ethical argumentation. So it's essentially how do lay people engage in ethical argumentation without lots of fancy words. So what does that look like? The lab protocols, number 3, is focusing more on how student designers engage in design activity, making evil stuff, and what are some of the evil things that get surfaced in that process? What are some of the evil roles that they take on? And why does nobody say no? And then the final one in the wild is looking at some outcomes of some observational work we did, watching UX designers in practice go about doing their work, and we tried to identify some of the structures that were actually shaping the kinds of ethical awareness they were able to take on, and then how that shaped the kinds of actions that they were able to take. So I'm more than happy to talk about any of these. If people want to vote in the chat with a 1, 2, 3, or 4, that will give us some direction, and then we will go next. Seeing 2 3s. Okay. Seeing lots of 3s. So I think we'll start there, and then we'll loop back to either 1 or 2, depending on how time goes. Now, Nilda, want to take until about 7 o'clock and until out for more specific questions. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Okie dokie. Let me find the start of 3, and then we'll get underway. Okay. And same rules apply. If you want to interrupt or ask for some clarifying detail, please use the chat to do that. I'm more than happy to repeat things or to go into a little bit more depth. With this one in particular, there are a couple of papers to look at. We have 2 more in progress that are in various stages of review. And I'm happy to speak to those as well. So first thing that you need to know that we did here is we did a lab protocol. And you may or may not be familiar with the lab protocol as a research device. This is an idea that comes from psychology, where they do lots and lots of lab studies. So if you sign up for a psychology pool in your undergraduate experience, you get to participate in lots of lab studies. And the idea is that you control the environment, you control the amount of time, you control the resources that are offered, and you give people a time to do something. In design, this has been used since the late 1980s as a way of studying design cognition and design practices in more depth than you might be able to out in the wild. So here, we used a lab protocol design. It was an hour-long session. We had 3 participants in each group. We had 4 groups in total. And we gave them 5 minutes of introduction. We gave them an ethically nuanced design task. It's a nice way of saying evil. And we gave them some materials to solve that design task at a very basic level. So paper prototypes, task flows, whiteboard sketching, that kind of thing. And then at the end, they presented their concept back to the researchers, and then we asked them some follow-up questions. They did not know until the end of the session that it was a deception study. So we told them at the outset that we were studying their design practices. At the end, we told them we were actually studying their ethical decision-making. So that's fun. Deception studies are enjoyable as long as you do the right consenting procedures. So we started out with 1 design task, and then we realized based on that initial design task that we wanted to find out more. And I'll talk to you more about the protocols in a second. So we ended up doing a series of 3 different lab protocols. For each one, we did 4 sessions with, so a total of 12 participants, so 36 across all of them. These were all a mix of undergrad and grad, although more biased towards undergrad, with a mix of user experience design students, industrial design students, and industrial engineering students. Using typical lab protocol procedures, we video recorded all the activity from 2 different angles. We recorded from the top down to look at how they were deliberating around the table. We also had a front view to look at what they were writing on the whiteboard and things like that. Got an audio recording. We did a full transcription, checked it all for quality. And here are the things that we asked them to do. So the first thing we asked them to do was to say, well, will people be evil if they're doing it for a good cause? And the answer was yes. And so we asked them, this is around the time of a major hurricane in Houston. And so we actually gave them wireframes of a website that was a nonprofit fundraiser in the Houston area. We asked them to redesign that website to encourage the users to donate to that nonprofit. And we always used in the design prompt the term by whatever means possible, or by whatever means necessary. So that it was up to them to decide what the limits of appropriateness were in terms of manipulation or persuasion. We also gave, for this one, we gave one of the 3 participants a little cheat sheet ahead of time, which included some persuasive principles, which were actually dark patterns, but they were relabeled as persuasive principles, which is actually all they are anyway. Building on B.J. Fogg's work from the 1990s in terms of building persuasion into your systems. So we did that first one. We found out some really cool stuff. We dug into the data, did quite a bit of analysis. And based on that, we did protocol number 2. And protocol number 2 was, well, they'll do bad and evil things if they're doing it for a good cause. But if they're doing it for like a nameless, faceless corporation, would they be so keen to do unethical things? In fact, yes, they are. They're more than happy to do unethical things for a web-based pharmacy as well. So in this case, we used the same structure. We gave them some printouts of the CVS website, and we asked them to promote CVS products over their name brand alternatives using whatever means necessary. And they did. And in the third protocol, we were wondering, well, screen-based design, that's one thing. Dark patterns are really in play already in those areas. And we're also used to dark patterns, that we would expect those to come into play in that environment. But what about Internet of Things devices? What about these newer devices that have entered our lives, where we engage with them in lots of different ways? We have different maybe expectations about how we engage with them. And in this case, we were wondering, would people redesign an application that's attached to a virtual assistant, in this case, the Amazon Alexa, to essentially get permission from users to collect all of the data from them continuously, which is something that Amazon actually would love to happen, and it's probably already happening, let's be honest. But we were wondering, what kind of procedures would they go through, starting to think about the multimodality of the interaction and the screen-based nature of the privacy prompt versus the way that the product would be experienced otherwise. And in fact, everyone was pretty darn evil here as well. And this was a little bit painful because some of them were, in fact, our undergraduate students. I was not running the session, so my PhD student was involved. But I thought I had actually done a decent job as a professor to talk about ethics and values and design and social responsibility and all the things, that we sort of framed up our session at the beginning. But some of these exact same students, given a prompt, didn't feel any power or any ability whatsoever to say, no, I'm not willing to do that. That's wrong, that's unethical, that's evil. And in fact, they accepted the prompt as a given. None of the teams ever pushed back and said, I'm unwilling to do this prompt. The most that we saw from participants was some sense of unease. And we've actually categorized some of that unease, where people will bring up, well, this makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. And then they'll often then tone down the dark patterns that they're engaging with, but they'll still engage in the inclusion of dark patterns with their work. So I'll sort of play through that with an example, just so you can get a flavor of what's happening. So in this case, this is the third protocol. So this is the Internet of Things trying to make Amazon Alexa collect all of the data, which again, it's probably already doing. So the participants started with the prompt, which was, how can we help the company always listen in on users' conversations? That sounds fantastic, more data. And so one of the participants was like, well, we could reword the user agreement. That sounds like a plausible thing that we could do. And so they were working with the interface and figuring out, well, how could we reward the user agreement to encourage somebody to say yes? Another person says, well, the goal is that we'd want people to say yes, because that's what the company wants. But I wouldn't. As a user, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't say yes. Although, same person, if we say that they agree, we can enable more features, because then people will want to do the thing. As long as we attach a little bit of value to it, it'll totally mitigate the larger effect of collecting all of the data all the time. And then somebody else sort of built on top of that same argument, saying we just need to offer a little bit of value in a different way than maybe we intended originally. And so in this case, the third participant said, well, maybe we can allow Alexa to listen to you in order to give you better features like song suggestions. So if it listens to everything, then it will know what songs are playing and it will be able to give you some more value add. So at one level, this actually doesn't sound that evil, because they are thinking about, well, how can we give the user value? But it's all cloaked underneath this larger unethical framing, which they never rejected, which is a little bit concerning. So if we look at some of the outcomes of some of our analysis, there are sort of three high-level points that I want to get across from this study and the way that I presented it. So the first one is that sometimes they were thinking about ethical engagement in other environments, and that they were engaging in the ethical trade-offs. So not only were they aware, they were thinking about the trade-offs, and then they were discarding the option which required them to make a sacrifice in this case. And so they said, you know, if you're in a job and it pays you good money and you don't feel ethically right, but it's between me and my job, what are you going to do? So saying, okay, well, if my job's at stake, I'm going to choose the unethical thing, even though it's something that might make me uncomfortable. And so there are certain costs that have to be weighed, and in most cases, they'd weigh the cost of employment higher than making the right decision on behalf of users. The second one came from an industrial engineer. And unlike user experience design, which is an emerging discipline, industrial engineering does have a code of ethics that students are taught about, that's included in their curriculum. And in fact, it's an ABET standard for accreditation. So it's guaranteed that all students will have to engage in ethical issues. And so this person knew about the ethical code. So they said, I know the IE standard is that everything's very approachable and you can find everything really easily. Transparency, all that good stuff. But I feel like in this case, you want to bury the information a little bit. So they not only recognized the right thing to do based on the code of ethics of their discipline, they turned around and did exactly the opposite in the decisions that they made on behalf of the user in the interface that they created. So this one is especially interesting to us because a lot of people historically within professional ethics and engineering ethics have said, well, it's really just an issue that people aren't being educated about ethics. If they got the right case studies, if the efficacy of that education was appropriate, then people would do the right thing. And in fact, we're seeing exactly the opposite, where people know what the right thing is, but they're choosing not to do it. And so that's actually a much harder problem to solve for. The final area where we saw a lot of impact was this idea of rationalization. And so you saw it with the value exchanges that were happening among those three participants in the sort of mock-up conversation that I showed you. In this case, one participant said, we're remembering that we're not designing for the user, we're designing for the company. And so this is really turning user-centered design on its head. User-centered design is all about putting the user at the center of the design process. And here they were saying, no, we're actually just designing for the company. The user is almost like collateral. And we don't necessarily need to worry about them as much. So any questions about what I just went over, feel free to put them in the chat. And it looks like I have a couple of questions, which I'll try to answer real quick. So the first one from Anu, could facial recognition functions also be dark patterns design sense, or if they truly collect user data? So it depends. There is a lot of work that's being done on facial recognition and its legality or illegality at the moment. Some of the biggest issues are actually describing to the user what in fact they're consenting to in relation to facial recognition. And a lot of companies will be like, oh no, it doesn't actually recognize you, or everything stays on the device, it's okay. And so there are some big data security issues around this, but there are also lots of potentially negative impacts that probably aren't even being fully explored by the manufacturers of these systems. And that is not necessarily a dark pattern, it's more just like a lie of omission, because they don't actually know what the impact of these systems are. If you take sort of most home security cameras, for instance, right now, they're perfectly capable of collecting data that could be facially recognized, Some people like Apple have started to create a closed ecosystem where the data doesn't leave the house, and there's a way to validate that the data hasn't left the house. For other devices, it's actually really easy to hack in and get an uninterrupted stream of data, even if they downsample or do other things to sort of increase the privacy of these systems. So this is, I think, really a challenge when you're looking at lots of different kinds of sensor data and what control the user has over those experiences. I'm not sure if I'm fully answering that question, but it's a start. So Ahmed asked, have the design students, the study participants, had they received any explicit or formal training on ethical practices of design? And the answer in the case of industrial engineering was certainly yes, because it's part of their core curriculum. And we can actually even, it's mapped back to a specific course and probably to even a module or other assessment. In UX, it was a little bit different because ethics is one of the strands across our curriculum, but we never sit down explicitly and say, we're going to talk about ethics today. So yes, they had heard about social responsibility. They had written a design philosophy. They'd engaged in sort of thinking about some of these practices, but maybe not as an explicit way as the industrial engineers. Industrial design, I think I'm pretty safe to say that industrial design does not formally teach codes of ethics like most art and design disciplines. So we actually didn't expect to see as much of that kind of interaction from them. Other questions? Let's see. I think I'm going to loop back to two or four. Might dip into four, and then we'll see how it goes. Ooh, a follow-up from Ahmed. Aren't scholars falling into the trap of measuring design against what we think people should be doing? I don't know if that's what's happening here. So in this case, of course, there are going to be ethical issues with any outcomes. And so here I'm primarily looking at the severity of sort of those outcomes and looking at them against the awareness of the designer. And I'll actually share a diagram at the end here to sort of frame some of that up. It is, of course, a value judgment about which designs you think are more appropriate. If your values are primarily capitalism, and that is for a lot of business owners, then what the team did and what I just presented is perfectly fine, because they're still telling the user what's happening. They're maybe just hiding it or sandwiching it underneath some other stuff that people would be more likely to say yes to. And that is, in some ways, marketing 101. I think the challenge that comes for all of us, and this is something that I talk about with my students a lot, is that there's an additive effect to a lot of interactions. So we see this in learning environments. We see this in general use of technology, where all of us have a data trail behind us now. And none of us, even data scholars, aren't really aware of the immensity of their data trail. And so to design something to allow a user to say, yeah, collect any data you want all the time, there would be a lot of scholars in the EU that have studied consent that would say somebody wouldn't actually be able to consent to that. Because even a data scientist can barely consent to that and really understand the full ramifications. What about an everyday individual with maybe low tech literacy? What about them? And so when we start to think about values relating more to autonomy and agency, then that surfaces a lot of these dilemmas that are not quite as easily solved. So when we're evaluating the interactions of these participants, we're primarily looking at it in terms of, first, what does their discipline say they should be doing or say that they should be valuing? And second, are they considering sort of the longer term impacts in relation to what they're being asked to do? And the answer was sort of unequivocally no.
After it's sort of like the experiment happened, did you have any opportunity to talk to the participants and kind of explain to them and then like get some feedback to them as to how they felt about the experience?
Yeah, it wasn't an explicit part of our protocol. I don't think we didn't have anybody that seemed ashamed by the work that they had done, which was a little bit sad. We didn't specifically tell them about dark patterns as a framing, although this sort of became infamous within the department. So all of our students knew by the end what we were actually doing and what was happening. It has greatly impacted the way that I sort of talk about ethics in the classroom, because these studies are about 2 years old now, or a year and a half old. And so I think we have seen some impact, but there was no immediate attempt to sort of educate people on what they just experienced and to sort of redirect their actions. One of the participants did end up becoming a lab member though, so that was fun. And we have a number of undergrads that do research on dark patterns and ethics with us more broadly. So I'll finish off with this, I think. This will frame up nicely the diagram that I'll share at the end, which is from the Gray and Bowling 2016 piece. So this piece was published at CHI this past year. And in this case, we observed designers in the wild. And this will sound very similar to the work that you see Elizabeth Bowling's group do, because that's the kind of work that Elizabeth and I are really interested in. Ahmed, who's on the line, has been involved with some of that work previously, and this is what we modeled this protocol after. So we observed each participant in pairs of participants that had been previously trained in ethnographic techniques. And we tried to observe them at least twice, preferably 3 times, and then we did a follow-up interview after the final observation, and preferably after some initial analysis of what we had found. We used a case study approach to talk about this, and so that included digital narratives that we had collected, transcripts from the interviews. We didn't collect any audio recordings from the actual observation sessions required. We relied completely on the field notes. We did thematic analysis using the Brown and Clark method to identify sort of 3 different categories. So individual practices of the personal designer, the organizational practices that they worked within, and specific examples of applied ethics, or sort of scenarios in which they had to engage with applied ethics. So these are the 3 individuals that we observed at a range of different kinds of UX agencies, consultancies, at different levels with different kinds of purpose. So you can see we have 2 business to consumer firms and 1 B2B firm. All of them were working in some kind of user experience capacity, but they did have different roles in terms of managerial responsibility. Each one of these participants we observed between 7 and 10 hours for 2 to 3 observation sessions, and then the follow-up interviews, depending on how verbose they were, was between 60 and 90 minutes. So the paper presents 3 cases. I'm not going to talk about all 3 cases. I am going to talk a little bit more about James, though, who had the most experience and was also in the highest level managerial capacity, and was in the best position to sort of impact the ethical focus of the organization. And so he is probably the one that was the most ethical in the ways that we've talked about so far, which is sort of cool. But the other examples, I think, are helpful counter examples to think through these issues. So in James's case, he was really trying to focus constantly on what are other people studying, what are other people learning in other disciplines, what's in the popular press, and how can I use that to make myself a better designer, make our firm a better firm, and help our junior designers be better and more aware junior designers. And so to do this, to analyze these sort of interconnections a little bit more, we identified this preliminary model, I think it's preliminary, model of ethical mediation. So this draws on activity theory, which some of you might be familiar with already. And basically, we're looking at the interaction effects between multiple entities, multiple sources of power, and how those correspond to the kinds of ethical engagement that we might expect. And so in this case, those map onto those 3 themes that we identified previously. So what is the individual doing? What is the organization doing? And what are the scenarios in which things are happening that we might want to attend to? We put the designer at the center of this because we don't want to view these design decisions as something that just happens. These are things that happen intentionally or unintentionally because of the interactions of designers, design teams within organizations. To sort of think through these instances a little bit more, you can sort of see that in our case, organizational practices constrained individual practices. So because the organization set itself up as an advocate for users and for stakeholders sort of in parallel, they actually disallowed individual designers from making certain kinds of decisions. So one of the things that we tracked over our observation period was over 2 sessions, there was the design of this portal which operated on a freemium model to help certain kinds of organizational practices. And one of the things that kept on coming back into the conversation over and over again was that it was okay for it to be freemium, but there had to be a reasonable amount of functionality that would come with the paid model. that it couldn't just be unlocking some functionality that people had already entered. And so one of the big disputes that came into play is the individual designer was actually constrained by the ethical character of the organization into saying, no, we actually need to steer the client away from doing the thing that they want to do because we think it's unethical on behalf of the user. So this is a scenario where even though there isn't any legislation or public policy, the company was willing to actually put themselves on the line to interact in the best interest of the user. We also found instances where applied ethics strengthened the individual practices. So sort of similarly in that same example, this designer was not only reading broadly from the psychology literature, from the neuroscience literature, was studying a lot of things about tech addiction in his free time because it was something that was interesting to him. And that was directly shaping his individual practices in ways that gave him better nuance and understanding about what kinds of decisions the firm might make, and also giving him a way to train junior designers to also be thinking about these kinds of issues in more robust ways. So what we ultimately found with this specific case was that he believed in regularly refreshing his knowledge to inform his practice from lots of different sources, not just from the obvious ones. He, as a manager, felt an immense responsibility towards the young designers within his team. And so his goal, he felt, was to build others' ethical character. Obviously, he wouldn't frame it in that way, but he saw that as a very important component of his work. And he tried to strike a balance, like in the example that I shared, by knowing the limits of taking advantage through your design. So obviously, to sell something, you're going to have to engage in some sort of value exchange, but to be very aware of what that value exchange looks like and to know why you're making a decision before you make it, rather than just sort of just deal with the impacts later on. So this resulted in this sort of preliminary diagram of ethical mediation. And we, in this paper, define a concept called ethical design complexity, which I think is especially useful in instructional and educational context as well, even though that's not what it was written for. And so we define it here, ethical design complexity, as the complex and choreographed arrangements of ethical considerations that are continuously mediated by the designer through the lens of the organization, individual practices, and ethical frameworks. And so here, we don't say ethics are just something you do, like pick the right paradigm or the right framework and then follow steps 1 through 10. We feel like that's way too simplistic. And it's also really naive to say, well, the designer should just do the right thing, because if their job's on the line, then they really often don't have the power to do what the right thing might be. And so we have to look at this holistically as an ecology of the individual designer, the designer that's growing over time, the organization in which they're set and the amount of power they have to sort of shape those organizational practices, and their knowledge of ethical concerns and the ways that they might come into play in their design work in lots of different ways. And that's where we see, I think, an immense opportunity moving forward in the training of designers and in thinking about these ethical impacts sort of moving forward. What I'll close off with is this diagram, which is from the Gray and Bowling 2016 piece. And this is one of the first times that Elizabeth and I were starting to sort of work through what are all the pieces that are at play that make design so difficult, and what are the pieces that make ethical design even more difficult to capture. So this is still a work in progress. This is what we published. I draw different versions of this depending on the week. I'll point out some sort of key variables which might inspire some questions from you moving forward from a design perspective. So here we put the designer, again, front and forward. So the designer in the top left is constantly performing and enacting their character. That's what they believe to be true, what they believe to be right, the knowledge store that they're building on, all those good things. And as they're designing something, they are continuously providing some sort of implicit guarantee that that design is going to be a good one. Now, good or quality varies widely based on discipline. If you're a civil engineer, your guarantee is that the bridge isn't going to fall down. But if you're an instructional designer, like, what exactly is your guarantee? That the learner is going to have fun? That the learner is going to learn something at the end of the day, even though they had a horrible experience? Like, what is your guarantee that's sort of bound up? And then how does that experience change over time? So an experience that you created a decade ago that was really fantastic might be really horrible now. And so how does, like, the societal forces, style, technological impact, all those kinds of things, how do those issues extend or change over time? Facebook is a great example. It started as essentially a way to creep on women in the dorm next to you at Harvard. And then it sort of became this mass market way of getting in touch with people. And now it's a way to provide really micro-targeted information that creates echo chambers and sources of disinformation. So which of those was the experience that was designed? It's all of the above, sort of. But you can't just look at the artifact or experience that was designed. You have to look at its evolution over time. Not just the explicit evolution of the product, but also the different inscribed values that come in from various societal and cultural forces over time. And ultimately, all of these things are relying on these inscribed or performed ethics and values. So one of the things that Elizabeth and I argued for in 2016, and I think we'd continue to argue for it now, is attention to what exactly are those values that you are inscribing. In instructional design in particular, the only values that seem to be valued in a lot of cases are efficiency, so efficiency of learner acquisition of the new knowledge, sometimes whether the learner had a good experience, and effectiveness. So you have efficiency, effectiveness, and sometimes whether they enjoyed it. And so are those the only values that we care about? Are there more values? Are there ways that you could actually engage in really dark and deceptive learning practices while still achieving those aims? And you would say that your job as an instructional designer was done? What would sort of take you, what would it take for you as a designer to say, no, this isn't an ethical design project. Let's redirect it, or I'm going to say no and let, move off of the design team. So those are some of the issues that I think are useful to consider as we move forward. Unfortunately, we have more time to study this because we got more money. So that's really exciting. So we're actually expanding our focus from UX design and dark patterns. We're still doing that kind of work, but we're looking at improving everyday ethics and socio-technical practice more broadly. So we are just about to launch our first wave of interview studies with people like from data science and front-end developers and marketers and UX designers as well, and trying to figure out from an ecological perspective, how as a team are they arguing for ethical practices? What supports do they need to do that work even better? And how can we maybe make a difference from a public policy perspective as well? So with that, I'm a little bit over time, apologies, but thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to engage in some more questions.
Thank you, Colin. Sorry. And I think you have a few questions in the chat or a few comments in the chat. And I have a few questions myself too, but I want to give everyone else an opportunity to write their questions or unmute and ask their questions. But greatly appreciate this talk. There's so many things that are running through my head. So I want to open the floor for questions. And maybe we can start with mine since...
That sounds great.
Okay, so so the last few minutes while you were talking and you were kind of providing that context of kind of like the evolution of a product that's created or something that was created, like you talked about Facebook and how it started and how the different interactions that it has taken and where we are now, and the ethical practice of it. It kind of got me thinking about learning analytics in the instructional design space, and and learning analytics, learning management systems, monitoring learners. Have you done anything on that space? I'm thinking like right now we're just kind of getting started with that, but then as I think about how this could evolve, it can become really dark, manipulative. So I don't know if you have any comments related to that, or if you've seen anything in the spaces that you run research related to dark patterns.
Yeah, I haven't done any work myself in the context of learning analytics and some of the other situations you've mentioned. I'd love to. I think there's a lot of important work to be done in those settings. I think learning analytics is probably the most concerning for me at this point because it's been around for so long that nobody questions the data gathering that's happening, or they don't fully understand it, or both. And so the fact that my students probably aren't thinking, oh, I can look at every single click they've made essentially through the LMS. I could if I really wanted to. Fortunately, we don't use the LMS; we use Slack. But that I think is a big concern, sort of moving forward, and thinking about how could these data be weaponized against a student. We're already seeing that. So there's been some work that came out about monitoring students' attention in class through facial recognition and emotion detection. So you can figure out how many of your students are engaged, like in a large lecture class. obviously really problematic. Even if you make the data more private, there are immense issues in terms of thinking about learner engagement, things that they might not be wanting to give away, even though it could be given away. And to me, this is roughly analogous to, this is going to sound like an extreme example, to some software that was used to do facial recognition and identify gender or gender identity and identify people who might identify as gay. And they actually got reasonably accurate results, but it's terrifying what that impact could have, because then this technology is actually forcing somebody to disclose something about themselves that they don't want to disclose, and they've gotten no say in the matter. And so I think that these kinds of issues will be continue to be problematic. Honestly, within the educational space, I think parents are already so disempowered and students already feel so disempowered that they're not even going to check to figure out whether these are sorts of issues that they might want to think about in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, I was thinking, because I know that a few of our alumni, they work at kind of like this for-profit private institutions, and they rely on learning analytics significantly. And as a student, I don't know if they ever, sign a form that says, hey, it's okay for you to like monitor every click that I do in the LMS or anything like that. So I'm just thinking that is a major ethical concern. The students not giving any authority for this to happen. It's just kind of like taken for granted.
Yeah.
The other thing that I was wondering, when you talk about educating learners or designers and ethical practices, and you said that it got you thinking about how you talk about ethics to your students. What are some things that that others could take on from your experience?
So actually, we did some of this work in class tonight, because when I talk about new theories and new frameworks and new approaches, I always try to talk about it now in terms of its potential and also in terms of how it could be used inappropriately. And I think I was doing some of that before, but I wasn't really explicitly aware of making that distinction. And so I think it was sort of getting lost in the mess. And so I was talking about social responsibility and about sort of framing up our responsibility as designers to produce ethical outcomes. But now I'm talking about it at a much more fine-grained level. So like, for instance, tonight we're talking about 3 different levels of awareness from Norman. So we're talking about visceral, behavioral, and reflective capacity to sort of engage. And as soon as I shared, visceral sort of interactions that everyone could sort of relate to, I also shared dark patterns examples about sort of the ways that you can manipulate visceral interactions and actually cut the user out of the or short circuit the user's agency in that sort of process. So try to show those 2 sort of themes in parallel as much as possible. I'm not a big believer in like ethics case studies, which is the way that most ethics education has happened up until now. But I think finding more ways to talk about it through like as sort of a continuous theme of the design process, and always be thinking about that, not only in terms of like how you identify who your learner or user population is, but also like, why did you choose to make this interface decision or this other one? So I think there's ethical implications for all of those decisions that are worthy to be talked about.
Okay, thank you. And I saw that Alejandra raised her hand. Alejandra, do you want to unmute? Okay, go ahead.
So I think you just answered that. It piggybacks off of what Dr. Romero-Hall just asked, but my question was going to be, what would be some best practices or perhaps some resources that us as instructional designers in the field, maybe it's not something that we look at day to day, but it's something that we can always have in the back of our mind, or it's something that we can reference in our design practices.
Yeah, no, so I don't know if there's anything on the best practice level. I mean, one thing is certainly being aware that the ethical paradigms exist and that they're not as scary as they sound. So as soon as somebody starts talking about consequentialist and deontological ethics, it gets scary, right? But all of us know how to think in terms of what could happen if this went down really badly, or what are some of the first principles that my field believes to be true. And so we all can do that. And so some of it's just demystifying the ethical frameworks that exist. The other thing, which I think is more important, is actually not only trusting your gut in sort of feeling like things are going down a bad path, but constantly using other perspectives to sort of think through your design situation. So as UX designers, we use personas commonly for this. And so you'll typically build personas to make sure that you don't have spots of low awareness. If you're thinking about, maybe a user with low vision, or a user with cognitive impairment, So actually surfacing that in the form of a persona helps you ask that persona, like, how would that experience be like for you if we designed it? And so if we think about learner experiences or user experiences more broadly, one of the first things that I'm commonly thinking about is like, who's being left out because of low technology access, because of their cultural background, because of their gender identity. There are lots of examples here that I think that we can rely on, and all it takes is a little bit of imagination to identify who some of those stakeholders might be, and then to even just try to put yourself in their shoes. Even if you don't have full awareness, just starting to ask the questions might make you realize, oh crap, we actually need to do a full-on learner analysis or user analysis of that individual, and we need to interview them. Or you might realize, oh, actually there are some best practices already out there on how to best design for those kinds of situations, and I can leverage that expertise.
Perfect. Thank you.
So Suzanne has a question as well. How big was the team that wrote those grants? The team was me. So both of these are single investigator grants. I do have one PhD student, but we're a very undergraduate focused program here. So I've had a couple of master's students working with me, but a lot of the pieces that you saw were authored in part or in substantial ways by undergraduates. So we really believe in doing undergraduate research here. At the max, I think my lab was about 10. We've had some people graduate. Right now we have about 4, but we're looking to hire a PhD student to start next year, and that'll start to build us back up.
I have another question, Colin. Most of the students that are in the program, in the instructional design program at UT, are going to work in the corporate sector. I'm sorry to say this, but corporate and ethics, it's like, they don't really go well together.
Yeah.
How do you manage if you're trying to be social responsible, thinking about equity, thinking about ethics, and working in in the corporate sector? Like, what has been your experience, since you did have that experience in the past?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So when I worked in an instructional design consultancy for about 2.5 years while I was doing my master's before I started my PhD. I worked with some pretty high-level clients in a lot of different environments. At that time, I didn't really have high ethical awareness. I hadn't gotten any training in my undergraduate, hadn't really gotten any training in my master's either to think about ethical issues. But there were some places where I definitely felt like really creeped out, like I don't feel comfortable doing this. And some moments of like, I feel like I'm doing right by the learners that are going to be using the products that I design. And so I think there are opportunities for both, but it's how they're cast. And so I'll focus on the positives first. And so if you think about inclusion and equity, this is actually something that a lot of clients in organizations want because it actually produces a better bottom line. So I always feel dirty doing this because I'd rather just treat people like people because they're people. But if what the company listens to is ROI or the fact that people are going to stay retained in their job longer, or whatever other metric matters to them, then use those metrics to promote ethical aims. And I think that that's a perfectly fine thing to do. I'll share one example briefly of a project I was involved in at the instructional design firm that I was working with. At the time, we were designing for all frontline training for a new lobby experience for a large hospitality brand. And they changed all their logo and branding and colors, and then they had also changed the entire lobby experience to have lots of new areas that didn't exist previously. And so our firm was supposed to be designing all the frontline training and all of the deliverables that they would sort of experience over that journey. This is the first project I worked on. I didn't know instructional design at all. And I was working with a copy editor to try to design onboarding materials for these frontline workers. The first thing that we learned about these frontline workers is that in general, they're much more likely to have English as a second language or third language. They're much more likely to be immigrants. or recent immigrants, second generation, and the time in job is a real concern because they often spin through lots of different jobs and the company wants to retain them, but often the person doesn't want to stay in the position for the length of time that the company wants to. And so one of the first things that we did as a team was to say, well, there's all this fancy branding. There were TV ads for this brand on at the time, but all the training materials looked like crap. It looked horrible. Nobody would be engaged by that thing. And so instead, we sort of turned it around. We got approval to spend a little bit more money on the onboarding materials with the promise that if they felt more valued up front, that they would stay longer in the job. And from all indication, I think we saw that to be the case. So we ended up designing like a custom die cut, glossy full color sort of brochure that was designed to hold their learner journey map, to hold the card that they would wear as part of their uniform, and would also be something that talked about the brand values in a way that they could bring it home and actually tell their family, this is the brand that I'm working for, I'm really proud of that brand, and here's what they believe in. And it was something that they could sort of track throughout their user journey. The other thing that we did, which was really key, I think, is we, and I don't know if there's any good example of this within the instructional design literature, is we capitalized on all the external branding efforts, and then we remapped all of their colors, all of their shapes, all of their fonts for learning purposes, so that all of their learner journeys at every level with all the media that was designed were following a very similar path to what people were seeing in terms of the external branding for the product. So in that way, we were actually trying to value the learner more, which in this case was that frontline employee. And we were able to use stuff like retention as a key characteristic to actually give them a better experience.
Wonderful. Wow. I have one last question, but I want to open the floor for anyone else. Does anyone have any additional questions?
Mine is more like a comment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually glad when Colin had mentioned earlier that sometimes users feel guilty, you know, when they see this metric, particularly on Facebook. I think I've been a victim where I see a number, probably an item, you know, online, and then there's a countdown. And I'm like, oh no, I need to get this. And I go back, and the numbers are counting down, like 2 hours to go. So, you know, and then you find yourself stuck in probably, you see an unexpected cost at some point, and you're like, where is this coming from? Then I feel bad that, oh no, what's wrong with me? I'm so dumb, you know? And then you kind of clarified that when you had mentioned, it's actually not the user's fault. It's going to be the designer's fault, you know? But then it's an experience for the user. But again, I would also add that when we have more awareness and probably facts to back up this issue of dark patterns, I think it could help some way for users to make informed decisions while we wait for policies to strengthen whatever happens.
Yeah. Yes. And I think this also has a big impact on how we design learner experiences, because how many learners have you talked to that just say, oh, I'm really stupid, or I'm just not as smart as I should be, or I'm sorry that I'm not understanding this the first time. And in fact, it's normally because they're human, and B, maybe the learner experience was horrible. Mm-hmm. And we just don't have enough words in our vocabulary as instructional designers to actually realize that the experience is at fault, not the learner. So I think this works in a lot of different ways as a diagnostic.
It kind of got me thinking that just like, I mean, lawyers have to take the bar exam and others, like, I wonder if there should be some sort of organization that is thinking about designers as ethical professionals, and we need to take some sort of oath or something, you know, because it has a major impact on, you know, users in general. So it really got me thinking about that. I also wanted to ask you is, can you give me an example of an asshole design? I'm kind of really interested in this now.
I have some examples for you. Let me grab one. Happy to send you the paper too.
I hope the name is ethical to asshole design.
Yeah, so we actually found 6 different properties of asshole designers. So we have a theme in our work. All reviewers probably know who we are, because we're always about decentering the design and centering on the designer. And so in this case, it's not what are asshole designs as artifacts that exist out in the world. No, they were designed that way. And so what are the properties that were used to make that happen? And so these are the 6 that we've identified based on our scan of the subreddit. there are 3 different examples here. This third one is probably the most evil. So it's a game where you either have to buy it. They also give you a countdown where you have to wait for it to refresh before you can do the next level. But you also need to get 3 keys from your friends. And so essentially, if you don't want to buy the thing, there's a 3-day lag between playing levels, assuming that you do all the things in the right order to get the new keys, to get everything together. So this is, we call this an issue of entrapment, where you're actually getting the user to engage in the system, but as soon as they're there and they're engaged and they want to play more, then you're actually putting lots of false restrictions around how they can play that game and how they can engage. The other one, which is really ironic, is A here, is being two-faced. It's a ad blocker browser that contains ads. So that's sort of fun too.
Oh gosh, I feel like Pandora is an asshole design. Every time I want to switch station, it comes like the free trial thingy that you have to pay. So
yeah,
it's just my personal experience.
Yep, lots of good examples though.
Okay, well, unless there are any other questions, I just want to take a minute. Oh, we got a few appreciation comments. So I just want to take a minute to thank Colin for doing this presentation for us. I've always had the pleasure of enjoying Colin's research, and we've kind of been in professional organizations together. And I always think, gosh, I wish I was as eloquent as Colin. I really appreciate him as a colleague. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your research, and I think we need more of this. So I look forward to reading some of your future work, and not only from user experience, user interface design, but also thinking about how it becomes applicable in the space of instructional design. So thank you very much for doing this, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you so much again. If I can be of help, or if I can connect with any other additional resources from my world, I'm more than happy to do that. I'm sure Nilda has my contact information. But thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you tonight.
Thank you. And I'll be sharing the link with you, Colin, and with everyone that was here, as well as some of our students in the program. So thank you, everyone. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording.